Good morning, possibly good afternoon, and perhaps good evening. Today in our history lesson, we are going back to one of our old entries, Joan of Arc, who right now is just getting captured by the army of Burgundy as she was trying to lift the siege of Compiègne. Don't worry about the result of her imprisonment. You are going to hear about it in about 7 days, more or less. For now, we're gonna leave and keep Jeanne in prison. I'm sure the judgment will be a fair one and nothing will come of it. What we're going for today is a follow-up of our previous video related to investigating what to play in 9.1 after looking at it through the raid lenses. Now we're going to look at it instead from Mythic Plus lenses, and then when we are done we can draw our conclusions, do a little bit of maths and add one and one together. Maybe it turns out there are multiple specs that are favored in both Raid and Mythic Plus and they would be an easy pick. Or maybe you will be presented with a really difficult choice where you really want to play a spec in Raid encounters, which is also pretty bad in Mythic Plus, or vice versa. So let's go and take a look. This time around we do the opposite. We start taking a look from the tank side rather than leaving them last like we did for raids. Starting with the point, obviously, that it's significantly more important in Mythic Plus than it is in raid encounters. Blizzard has done a good job making tanking a little bit more interesting than just spamming a bunch of Sunder armors like we had in Vanilla. However, it is still not a crucial part of raid encounters, whereas for Mythic Plus you can argue tanking is the more important role, might even be the strongest role that you're looking for in a Mythic Plus group, so it takes precedence over the rest. Unfortunately, with the precedence or not, the answer is almost as boring as the tank answer we went through in raids. Their answer for raids was of course Vengeance and Brewmaster because they bring debuffs and whatnot. In Mythic Plus there isn't really much of an interest in the debuffs that you can bring. You only have 5 players, you're not really going to fill the entire party with the debuffs. Also, these debuffs and buffs are not going to benefit 20 people, they're only going to benefit 5, so the effectiveness is much reduced. You can still argue the Vengeance Demon Hunter in Mythic Plus is still a good debuff to bring because it's magical damage taken, and usually at least 2 of your DPSers are going to be magical damage based, so it is still pretty helpful and handy to have it, but it's certainly not why Vengeance Demon Hunter is dominating the charts when it comes to being a tank in Mythic Plus. It's probably the 17th or 19th reason why picking a Vengeance Demon Hunter in Mythic Plus is good, having the magical damage debuff. If we look at the situation in terms of popularity and representation of Mythic Plus tanks, nothing really has changed in months. Vengeance Demon Hunter is still very popular, the popular spec for tanking. When you look at keys in total from plus 15 and up, it is still somewhat good, somewhat decent to have multiple specs above 10%, averaging 15%. Representation is nice, but then you go up into the plus 20 range and it's half the entire representation being taken by Vengeance Demon Hunters, and also if you go even higher it starts getting closer to 95% of Vengeance Demon Hunter. Basically almost all tanks are going to be Vengeance, which means if we are going into 9.1 you have to look at a few things. Number 1, are Vengeance tanks getting nerfed? Number 2, are any of the other tanks getting buffed? Number 3, is Mythic Plus going to change the way in which you want to tank? Those are the 3 things you have to look for. The first thing, no, Vengeance Demon Hunters so far have not gotten nerfed more than what they already have. Vengeance Demon Hunters have gone through a series of nerfs, from the heal of their abilities and their souls, from their conduits, which were nerfed, the cooldown reduction to their fairy brand, which possibly might have even turned into a buff, because it's reducing the cooldown of your spell devastation now. You have gotten the hotfix, which is now making you take more magical damage, and your physical damage taken buff that you have received is half as strong as what all the other tanks received. So the point number 2, when it comes to other tanks being buffed, yes, tanks have received in 9.0.5 a 10% magical and physical damage taken buff, all of them except for Vengeance, which got a much tinier one. In the current patch notes of 9.1, there aren't many major buffs to Protection Paladin, Protection Warrior, Guardian Druid and Brewmaster Monk. The only tank that has gotten decent buffs is Blood Death Knight, particularly to their damage, one of the features that is much more important in Mythic Plus than in raid encounters when it comes to tanks. Now, is all of this enough to justify looking for any other tank in 9.1 that isn't a Vengeance Demon Hunter if you are just interested in raid encounters? No. The answer is no. There is still not enough evidence to support the notion that Vengeance are not going to be the two GOAT tanks in Mythic Plus. Now, we are still left with the third question, which is, what about the actual Mythic Plus key? What about if the way in which you want to clear the key, the way in which you want to pull, basically the meta, is changing? Because let's not forget that Vengeance has gotten to this point because their toolkit, the way they work, is very fitting with the way you want to complete keys in Mythic Plus. They have very short cooldowns, at or below 60 seconds that they can use for almost every pull. They have very good kiting capabilities, being able to leap in and leap out, which fits very well with the way you want to play in Mythic Plus. You have your Elysian Decree, your Fiery Brand, you have your Fell Devastation, all on a 1 minute cooldown or lower, that can be repeatedly used for every pack, every major pack, which is something that basically no other tank has. None of them are able to have this amount of short cooldowns to use for every pack. Their cooldowns are too large and too big to fit in the pulse of Mythic Plus, which makes them much less capable compared to a Vengeance Demon Hunter. So this last question could be answered if we knew something I complained about a few days ago, if we knew about the affix, which is what is kind of ruining this video, because it is a considerable question mark that could change things. Now, given that there haven't been any other major changes and that we are not going to have any other major affixes for Mythic Plus, so no changes, no balance to things like Tyrannical or Fortified or any of the other affixes, the rotating ones, I don't think it's going to be enough. Whichever seasonal affix we are going to have, and even then, Vengeance would be starting with such a lead over the other tank specs that it is still unlikely to see them not be the main to-go spec for Mythic Plus. Now, moving on to the other role for Mythic Plus outside of the DPS is going to be healers. Now, the situation concerning healers has also remained pretty standard. In the last few months, it's been a lot of Shaman and a lot of Paladin. Mistweaver is basically nowhere to be seen. We have seen the rise of Holy Priest, way more so than before, now matching basically Discipline Priest in Mythic Plus. And then you have Restoration Druid, which is the odd one out. Technically speaking, it is still the third most popular spec, but if we compare that to what they used to be, by the end of BFA, it's a massive drop. So looking at 9.1, you have to ask the same questions we asked for tanks. Are the strongest ones being nerfed? And the answer actually this time is yes. Because even though Restoration Shaman isn't really being touched, Holy Paladin is getting nerfed, particularly in their damage. Also, a little bit in their healing and in their output, because their Holy Shock is being nerfed. Essentially the usages, because your Crusader's Might talent is getting nerfed, which means you're going to be getting less Holy Shocks off over an encounter. And then of course the damage nerfs. Many of your abilities getting nerfed by 10%, some of these abilities getting nerfed by an additional 10%, including what we pointed out as being the major issue of Holy Paladin, which is Ashen Hallow, and the burst damage you can do within that window. So yes, the first question is actually answered. We do have some nerfs for Holy Paladin. Holy Paladin also is more important because it is better, so to speak, than Restoration Shaman. Even though Restoration Shaman is more popular, even though Restoration Shaman is more represented, take in mind that when you look at the highest keys, so not just the plus 20s, but plus 24, 5, 6, and 7, it's basically 90% Holy Paladin, because that's when damage becomes a super important part of your key, and Holy Paladin has too much of it to miss out on. So now the question becomes, are the nerfs going to be enough? Are they going to justify not using Holy Paladin? The question is answered very quickly, because it is no. Even if you nerf Holy Paladin by 10 or by 20% of its damage, they are still going to be doing 2 to 3 times the amount of damage that most of the other healer specs can do. And none of the other healer specs are getting their damage buffed in any way, in any capacity. So the damage that is being nerfed still is not really going to fix the issue that Holy Paladin is the only one that can do that heavy amount of damage while still being able to heal. Even if Restoration Shaman went full damage without casting abilities for healing, they would still be at half the damage or less than a Holy Paladin. So it's not really going to fix this problem, and this problem, damage in Mythic Plus done by healers, is still very important in Mythic Plus, which means Holy Paladin will remain relevant regardless of these damage nerfs. What about the second question, which instead of being are the top specs getting nerfed, is are the lower specs getting buffed. We also do have a yes. We have just gotten some buffs to Mistweaver Monk, and we have also gotten buffs to Holy Priest. We have not gotten any significant major buffs to Restoration Druid or to Discipline Priest. In fact, Discipline Priest has gotten nerfed, although nerfs to Spirit Shell are not very relevant to Mythic Plus because you're not really using Spirit Shell to begin with in Mythic Plus. So it's mostly just Holy Priest and Mistweaver Monk. Now, Mistweaver Monk's buffs are actually pretty good because they are also buffing your damage, because Fist Weaving is essentially the scuffed version of what Holy Paladin is doing damage while also using your damaging abilities. Mistweaver Monk is can tune itself with the Ancient Teachings of the Monastery Legendary and Rising Mist talent to do damage with their Blackout Kick, Tiger Palm, Rising Sun Kick and whatnot, and now it's got them buffed. But similarly to Holy Paladin, the damage nerfs to Holy Paladin are too small to matter, and the damage buffs Mistweaver are also too small to matter when it comes to Mythic Plus. At the end of the day, Mistweaver still doesn't have a significant damage buff to use in Mythic Plus. They don't have the equivalent of Wings plus Ashenalo plus even all the Avenger that they can stack on top of itself in a Mythic Plus key. They can't use a legendary like Med Paragon, which increases the damage of their abilities and makes Wings even longer. When you look at Mistweaver, yes, your damage is getting buffed, but you have literally no other talent in your toolkit that increases your damage in any way. You're already forced to use a legendary that even allows you to do this, whereas for a Holy Paladin is natural to have Judgment, to have Crusader Strike, to have Holy Shock, and to use them in your rotation, whereas monks have to use Ancient Teachings of the Monastery if they even want to make it happen, and you don't have any other base major cooldown that you can use to follow this. Even your Covenant abilities are not that powerful in comparison. So yes, there is a buff to Mistweaver, and no, it's not really gonna help that much. The buffs to Holy Priest are also more raid-oriented. The Symbol of Hope buff can also have some effectiveness in Mythic Plus, reducing your defensives. Mythic Plus and personal defensives are pretty useful and pretty helpful, but when you lack everything else, particularly the fact that you have basically negative damage as a Holy Priest, it makes it very hard to envision Holy Priest ever being used in Mythic Plus, because after a certain moment, the amount of healing you have in Mythic Plus doesn't matter anymore. After a certain moment, you cap the amount of possible healing you can do, and what matters next is how quickly you can kill the enemies. If that wasn't enough, maybe you could say, well, if you have tons of healing, you can keep the tank alive for longer, meaning you can kill the pack for longer. The problem then becomes, number one, the cooldowns. The burst cooldowns of your DPS are going to end, which means your damage is going to drop tremendously, and number two, you would need also some very strong defensive cooldowns to keep your tank up, to allow for the pool to continue longer, which is also something Holy Priest does not have in Mythic Plus. Guardian Spirit is just about the weakest of the external cooldowns a healer can give to their tank. Having lots of healing and lots of HPS is not really going to help, and getting buffed in one of your major cooldowns that doesn't really give you any major defensiveness, at least to your tank, is not really going to help too much either. So yes, Holy Priest and Mistweaver are getting buffed, but I don't think it's going to amount to anything. I think the safest play when it comes to healing still remains Holy Paladin over Resto Shaman as well, which is also much like the tank, a similar answer to what we had in Raids. In Raids, the answer was Brewmaster and Vengeance, and in Mythic Plus is Vengeance, so seems like a no-brainer to continue inflating the number of Vengeance players. And when it comes to healing, the answer was Paladin and Priest, and now it's Paladin for Mythic Plus, so that's also a rather simple answer. Now we're gonna go to the more varied one, the more variable answer, which is the DPS. So for DPS, it's gonna be interesting because we have gotten a few changes throughout these months. We have seen Windwalker rising, we have seen Fury Warrior rising, we have seen Windwalker getting hotfixed and going back a little bit. We have seen Havoc, Demon Hunter, being buffed and raising in popularity again. And melee DPS specs are not receiving a lot of focus in 9.1. Currently, the only major change is the nerf to AMZ that is being thrown at Unholy Death Knights. Rat Paladin, Outlaw Rogue, Frost DK Enhancement, Windwalker are all pretty much untouched. Fury Warrior, which has gotten buffed multiple times before 9.1, is also remaining in its current strong state. So the call, when we were talking about raids, was Rogue and Fury Warrior, or Warrior in general. In Mythic Plus, you do have more room to try out Windwalker and Havoc, because Windwalker and Havoc were doing fine and are doing fine right now, and they are not really getting nerfed in 9.1. It's not that they're going to be going weaker in their power. Now, normally, since we would be looking just at Mythic Plus, we could also suggest Windwalker and Havoc, because Windwalker and Havoc are doing fine right now in Mythic Plus. The problem, they are helped by the fact that, again, needing debuffs and buffs in raid encounters gets heavily skewed by which tanks you have, and Windwalker, when you have a Brewmaster, and Havoc, when you have a Vengeance tank, makes them much less desirable in raid encounters. But for Mythic Plus, you can just be taken for the damage you're doing and the utility you can bring in a 5-man party, so they have much more room, more right to exist. However, if I had to compile a list of specs that scale the worst throughout an expansion, Windwalker and Havoc would be pretty high up my list. As a matter of fact, they would probably be first and second in terms of bad scaling, in terms of bad increased power throughout the expansion given by their item level. They don't do much with their secondary stats, particularly Windwalker. But also Havoc is not really doing that well. So if we are looking at 9.1 and we are looking at specs giving them some 30 to 35 more item levels, then I still think Fury Warrior is eventually going to continue scaling and outperforming a Windwalker Monk. The same can be said for a Rogue, outperforming a Havoc Demon Hunter, if you do not have very powerful borrowed powers changing the landscape. We have also went over the borrowed powers that will happen in 9.1, and the major one that could possibly change things, the borrowed power from the 3 Shard of Domination bonus that you can get, are only going to be active in raid encounters, so not even in Mythic Plus. So you don't even have that possible wild card if you're playing melee DPS. You can say, to be honest, you can say that melee is also kind of at a disadvantage, because this expansion we are having a switcheroo, where instead of playing with 2 melee DPS specs and 1 range DPS spec in Mythic Plus, you are playing with the opposite. You're playing with 2 range DPS specs and only 1. So the competition is even higher. Looking at being a viable spec becomes even tougher, because there is going to be much less room for you. There has been much less room for you this entire expansion when you want to get into Mythic Plus. So if you had like 4 spots for melee specs, you could say, sure, Rogue, Fury Warrior, Windwalker, and Havoc are all viable. But if you only have 1, if you're only going to pick 1 melee spec, then suggesting 4 of them starts to become sort of like a very optimistic take. Because of this, I still have to go and default to Rogue, because Rogue right now is the only spec in the game that has 2 high and viable competitive specs for 2 different activities at the same time. They have Assassination in raid encounters and they have Outlaw in Mythic Plus. And even then, Outlaw can still be played mostly fine in raid as well. So it's a very luxurious situation for you to be in, and it would be just wise and logical to take advantage of that, rather than saying, I'm gonna be a hipster and try to play Enhancement Shaman or Red Paladin. There is no logical reason for you to do that unless you just play them. As I mentioned, you can take the Chad way and say, I don't care about meta, I'm enjoying playing Red Paladin a lot, then you can play Red Paladin, it's fine. But since we're looking at meta here, since we're looking at trying to predict which of the specs are going to be very popular and will help you get some invites, then Rogue seems to be the easiest answer. The second one being Fury Warrior, because I do believe they will continue to scale pretty well. And I believe Windwalker and Havoc will continue being taken and will continue to be rather popular until eventually they will progressively scale worse and worse and other specs are going to overtake them. Given that there have not been any major changes to any of the other unplayed spec, or less played specs, so Feral, Enhancement, Subtlety, Frost Decay, Assassination Rogue when it comes to Mythic Plus, Survival, and Retribution, there is no real reason to think that anything is going to change coming into 9.1 for these specs. They're not really going to overtake any of the major popular spec just because they're going to be scaling better. Just because of 20 or 30 item levels they will suddenly turn broken. That's just too little. They need something else, and for now that something else is not happening. There also doesn't seem to be any turnaround for Unholy, which started the expansion very popular in Mythic Plus and then progressively lost its polish over the course of a couple of nerfs to the damage, and then now in 9.1 they're also getting the nerf to AMZ, which is of course less bad in Mythic Plus because you only have to absorb for 5 people instead of 20, so you're gonna absorb more, but certainly not as powerful as it was before, so it's still a nerf. So given my picks for melee DPS, you can see the importance I put in being able to have multiple viable specs. The power you have in having multiple lives to play your character by simply changing a spec, as opposed to just having one option in one hybrid DPS spec that has no backup plan. It is worth a lot for DPS specs. Now, looking at the range DPS. Range DPS have gone through some changes in the last few months. Just looking at this, for example, Elemental has nearly doubled its representation from 5 to 10%. We had Hunters with marksmanship at its peak, nearing 30% representation, and then going down to 24, and now it's down to 17. We have also gotten Fire Mage getting lower in representation, and then the currently highest represented is Balance, and Balance is getting quite a few nerfs. So the landscape for range DPS specs seem like it's opening up. It's opening up for more opportunities. Now, some things have to be taken into consideration. For example, yes, Balanced Druid is getting nerfed in damage, but one of the powerful points of Balanced Druid in Mythic Plus is that they have 3 ends, which are incredibly powerful. One could even say overpowered for Mythic Plus, and the advantage they can give to the tank for several mechanics to cheese or to simply reduce the damage taken as a proper defensive cooldown for your tank. Which to me, that talent alone makes them viable and a very powerful pick for high keys, just because of that, even if the damage is getting nerfed. There are of course questions given by the balance tuning. Affliction is getting nerfed in favor of Destruction and Demonology. Are they also going to pass Affliction in Mythic Plus? What about Fire Mage getting nerfed in favor of Frost Mage getting buffed? And what about the newly buffed Elemental? That is where you're gonna find most trouble deciding this role, the DPS role for ranged. So we are back to giving the risky answer, just like we did in raids. Picking Balanced Druid when you know it's getting nerfed, even though it is the currently best performing one, or one of the best performing ones in raids, is very dangerous, because if you get to play it and turns out the nerfs were too big, you're screwed, because you can't respec to a different range DPS spec within Druid. In Mythic Plus the answer can be the same, although I do think it's safer. I think that the nerfs in damage in raid encounters are much more important, because it's not that Balanced Druid is bringing anything else major to a raid besides Stampeding Roar, so it's much worse for them to get their damage nerfed. But for Mythic Plus I don't think it's as bad. As a hybrid with just one spec available to itself, when it comes to damage, I think it's a more solid pick, just because of the utility it can bring in Mythic Plus, which is not one of the things that is getting nerfed. The other two hybrids are Shadow Priest and Elemental. Shadow Priest, which of course is also getting nerfed, even their AoE legendary, which is much more impactful in Mythic Plus, Shadow Flame Prism, is getting nerfed. They are, you might say, getting buffed in the sense that their dots are getting buffed in damage and their Devouring Plague is getting nerfed in damage, so their single target is weaker, but their dots are stronger. Even then, the buffs are slightly too small and the mobs in Mythic Plus die too quickly, and it would take you quite a bit of time to spread the dots in the first place, so it doesn't look like you're gonna get as much power as you used to do before. And at the end of the day, you're still a hybrid spec with only one option, so I think it's still not very safe to go for Shadow Priest. The only spec that is a hybrid that is getting buffed, or has just gotten buffed, is Elemental. Elemental can bring something similar, nowhere near as powerful, but something similar to 3 ends, which is your Hurt Elemental. It does have things like offensive purges, off healing, AoE stuns, so when it comes to utility, it's still pretty rich. None of them is particularly broken. There is no Shroud, there is no Immunity, there is no 3 ends, there is no Dispel and Rage or Ursol's Vortex or something like that, but they have plenty of it. I still think it would be a little bit too dangerous to focus on an Elemental Shaman when it comes to Mythic Plus. They still lack, in the end, they still lack Burst. No matter how you look at it, even if you try to set yourself up with Primal Elementalist and Storm Elemental and try to clump all your cooldowns together and look at the huge numbers. At the end of the day, Combustion has a 60-second cooldown and your Storm Elemental has a 150-second cooldown. So yes, congrats, you did as much damage as a Combustion mage, except in 60 seconds the mage can do it again and you can't. Which also, I guess, is the reason why Combustion is getting nerfed. But still, this can also be said for single target damage and Convoke the Spirits. or AoE damage and Wild Spirits. It's the same. Your cooldown that makes you look like a very strong spec in Mythic Plus is still a little bit too long. We mentioned how important and why Vengeance Demon Hunters are so strong as tanks, which is the short cooldowns, and the same is applied to range DPS and melee DPS. The timing of their cooldowns and the ways in which they can dish out the damage. Elemental also suffers from the continuous problem this expansion of kiting. The more you have to kite, the harder it's going to be for you to do damage because of your Earthquake, which is stationary on the ground. So as soon as you keep moving your pack because you're trying to kite because of Necrotic, you're trying to kite because of Raging, because of Sanguine, what have you, you're gonna be losing damage because of Earthquake, which is actually a very significant problem for Elemental Shamans in Mythic Plus. So I just don't have the confidence to feel like Elemental Shamans are going to become meta or a very reliable pick as range DPS. Another one I'm not confident in is Hunters. I mentioned when it came to raiding that despite the hotfix nerf, despite marksmanship becoming outscaled, marksmanship is a very front-loaded spec. They do a lot with little gear, and the more you have gear, the less you gain compared to other specs. So over the course of the expansion, they will be going lower in effectiveness and power. But I said in raids, I didn't care, because in raid encounters, you still want hunters for mechanics and immunities. Whereas in Mythic Plus, this changes. Immunities are important, but not that much anymore. And more importantly than immunities, your mobility, your doing mechanics part of raid encounters isn't really there when it comes to Mythic Plus. So the fact that your damage has gone lower is much more important in Mythic Plus, which is why I don't feel like Hunters and Marksmanship is going to be that more relevant in 9.1. Beast Mastery is scaling. Beast Mastery has gotten buffed. I don't think it's gonna be enough. I think eventually it will reach the point where it will have scaled quite well and become a good spec, but I don't think 9.1, at the very least, the first part of it is gonna be enough for Beast Mastery to just take over as a spec. So if I discount Shaman and Hunter and Priest, the answer for ranged is going to be Balanced Druid, despite the riskiness of the nerfs. Then you have Mage, despite the nerfs to fire, it still does have a very good damage profile for Mythic Plus. Yes, Combustion is getting nerfed in its cooldown because of Kindling, so it's gonna be available every 75 seconds instead of every 60, so it's slightly worse, but the whole toolkit of fire works still pretty well in Mythic Plus, and even then, Frost Mage is still doing fine in Mythic Plus, so it's a decent alternative to fire. The only one I haven't touched on is Warlock, because Affliction was already having problems in Mythic Plus. It wasn't very popular. It was the biggest discrepancy between effectiveness in raids versus effectiveness in Mythic Plus. They had the least amount of popularity in Mythic Plus given their power in raids, and now they're getting nerfed. They are not doing too hot right now on the PTR, so little hope for Affliction, in which case you have to start hoping for Destruction and Demonology. I have no hope for Demonology to become meta. I just don't think people are gonna catch on to just playing a multitudes of pets based spec, and when it comes to Destruction, I do think it can become good in Mythic Plus. I also think it's too early. It's on a similar situation with Beast Mastery. I don't think it's their time yet. If I had to look at all the specs as a whole, I think Balance and Fire are still, despite the nerfs, pretty decent specs for Mythic Plus looking into 9.1. For Mage, simply because they have two specs, which at the end of the day still look fine, Fire and Frost. And for Balance, it's just because of the utility. I do think Elemental has already passed Balanced Druid when it comes to damage, and when it comes to just the pure amount of damage they can bring out in a key, in both AoE and single target. Maybe less single target and more AoE, depending on the build. But the utility, the 3 ends in particular that a Balanced Druid can bring, don't forget the combat res that a Balanced Druid can bring, given that your tank is a Vengeance, so no combat res. Your melee spec most of the time is going to be Rogue or Windwalker, so no combat res. And your healer is a Paladin or a Shaman, so no combat res. It makes Balanced Druid your combat res in your party. Outside of combat res items, it's the only class with a combat res that is popular right now. So I do think all these things combined with all the rest, the off-healing of Art of the Wild, Ursul's Vortex, Enrage Dispel, Entangling Roots, all these things, I think would still keep it pretty relevant, despite the risk of playing a hybrid spec that's about to get nerfed. Now that we have gone to the range specs, we have seen all the roles, and disappointingly enough, there doesn't seem to be too many major changes to what we have observed in this current season of Mythic Plus, because tanks go from just play Vengeance to just play Vengeance in 9.1. When it comes to healers is continue to put your stocks in Holy Paladin because the damage nerfs are not enough not to make Holy Paladin very powerful in Mythic Plus because of their damage. Their damage will still be far and away the most damage of any healer, which is going to be relevant in Mythic Plus. And then you have the DPS, which are a little bit more flexible because, number one, we still, as a reminder, we still don't know the affix that Blizzard plans to introduce or how much the affix is going to change the key. So is it going to put more importance on single target? Is it going to put more importance on AoE? Is it going to make you pull more pulls at the same time? So bigger, larger cooldowns every 2 or 3 minutes, or pull more quickly, pull slower numbers, meaning 1 minute cooldowns can get more value out of it. These things could change which specs become good because they fit the affix very well. Unfortunately, we don't know about it. So it's easier, or rather it's safer, to default to what is popular now. So seeing a rogue making up for 30% of all melee specs in keys higher than 20, rogues are not getting nerfed. There are no other melee DPS specs getting severely buffed, so there is no reason to think that anything else is going to overtake rogue. And then you have the range DPS, which is a similar situation. You look at the specs that are already getting nerfed and the specs that have been declining over time, like Marksmanship Hunter and Affliction Warlock. The only difference is the outliers the only differences are the outliers between the things that are important in raids versus the things that are important in Mythic Plus. I would tell you, don't play Balanced Druid if you want to raid, because Ursul's Vortex and Treants and all the other batch of utility that a Balanced Druid can bring in raid is borderline irrelevant, and only their damage and their damage profile matters, whereas in Mythic Plus, even though their damage and damage profile is getting worse, their utility is still untouched and is still extremely powerful in Mythic Plus, so it is still worth focusing on a Balanced Druid. Similarly can be said for Marksmanship and Hunter in general. Their mobility and utility of having an immunity, for example, is very important in raid encounters, but in Mythic Plus, it loses quite a bit of value. So that is how I would see things. The only one that is seemingly immune from being suggested not to be played is Mage, just because of their historical strength that Blizzard has kept them in. The chances that Blizzard fucks up 3 specs out of 3 of Mage and basically makes all 3 of them unpopular is unprecedented. So that's where my chips are. I am betting on historical records of Mages remaining pretty relevant, even though Fire is getting nerfed, sure. Now that the recap is done, we can also stop our Mythic Plus overview of specs looking into 9.1. I hope this helped clear some things up on which specs are looking good, are looking nice for the upcoming tier, the upcoming season. It's going to be a more spicy season because now you're also going to get your shiny achievements and rewards for doing +20s, not just +15s anymore. Yes, you're going to be increasing in item level and Mythic Plus keys are going to be scaled up. So in the end, doing a +20 in 9.1 will be the equivalent of doing a +18-ish in 9.0.5 right now. But I do think it's going to bring more players, more people being more interested in pushing Mythic Plus rather than just quitting and defaulting to doing 1 per week once they get their Keystone Master, their old Keystone Master. So I am expecting more participation than we have gotten recently in Mythic Plus. Let me guys know what you think. Which specs were you eyeing? Which specs were you looking for playing? Particularly to the people who had Mythic Plus in mind. More so than raid encounters, more so than raiding. They were planning on focusing a little bit more on Mythic Plus. So let me know your picks for this upcoming season. Thanks anyways for watching the video. You should subscribe. Otherwise, thanks anyways for watching the video. If you have enjoyed it, you should subscribe. If you didn't and you don't want to subscribe, then at the very least, you can still subscribe to my OnlyFans anyways. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, the only thing that's left is a massive dose of copium, hoping for a good new affix to shake things up a little bit.